So I'm sure for any of you that have trained within the context of strength for any decent period of time, you've known that there's been some sessions where you just felt incredible. You went in there and you felt so strong, you just felt so good that day that you decided to either max out or hit a PR or anything like that. But with that, I'm sure you've also had sessions where you're like, I don't know why this is a bad day. I just feel like garbage. I don't feel strong. I was supposed to hit X, Y, or Z heavy set today, and it just was not in the cards. And really what that comes down to is just not having a proper understanding of what fitness and fatigue are and how to properly manage them with a proper fitness fatigue model, and not knowing how to utilize that to know what session is going to be very high performing and which ones might not be quite as high performing. And today I'm going to actually be using a case study discussing two of my clients that do have rather unique looking fitness fatigue models, and kind of how just the important part of all this is going to be data tracking and making sure that that athlete is going to be a good communicator as well as yourself, and using that data to keep putting a better program on paper constantly. And I'm going to be using that fitness fatigue model to explain why a session looks like this on week 1 of a block, and how we go to actually having more load and less RPE just 3 weeks later. And here it is again on his following block, and just using this data and just using this knowledge to create a proper amount of just knowing when adaptation is going to be happening, how do we display adaptations happening, how do we prove that they are happening, and just knowing that when's going to be high performing and when isn't. And lastly, here's my boy Nick. I'm going to use him. I'm going to throw him in the mix today as well, just because his fitness fatigue model is probably the most unique I've ever seen or ever heard of. But it's very important to notate, because once again, he does a great job at filling out his RPEs and actually communicating with me. That way we can create this predictability of how a squat will look like this on week 1, and then 5 weeks later on week 6, it will look like this. So here is a rather generic fitness fatigue model. Once again, this isn't anything highly accurate. This is just kind of a good example to show you guys the teachings of what I'm discussing today. And in the past, when I've brought up a fitness fatigue model, it's been much more within the context of an actual weekly structure instead of a block structure, meaning that what kind of sessions and what kind of, information can we use to determine when's going to be the right time to schedule our secondary or tertiary session to really put that primary session up on a pedestal. But more so today, this is me just kind of comparing the actual performance and what kind of adaptations are being yielded from each primary session to the next, and obviously the other sessions will fold into that as well, but kind of using that primary session as our gauge, making sure that adaptations are happening properly during the block. So obviously we have 3 lines here. First, let's look at the blue line. Basically, that's going to be the level of fitness or the level of skill that is developed from a session, and how that does increase from week to week, and how that changes. Because obviously, if we are lifting something heavy, or if we're just performing any skill, our body's going to try to refine that skill and try to adapt to it and be better at it the next time it does it. And that's obviously the case with powerlifting and lifting as well. But anytime that we do, especially in the case of powerlifting, have a heavy session, we're going to see that there's going to be a level of fatigue that comes with it. Obviously, if we're trying to lift something heavy and we're trying to get adaptations to that, we have to lift heavy, and we have to have some sort of decent workload or volume attributing to that to create a bigger demand of that yield, right? So anytime that we are doing that, we're going to have a decent level of fatigue as well. And you see that green line in between the red and the blue, that is our level of performance. So kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning of this video, saying what days do we feel good and what days do we not feel so good. And that's going to be kind of really what is happening with that green line there. And what we can see is that kind of the easiest way to summarize this is that we're essentially looking for, if we're trying to find a high performing session, we're essentially looking for when that gap in between the level of fitness and the level of fatigue is as great as possible. We want fitness to be that much larger than fatigue. And by no means does that mean that, fitness is at an all-time high or fatigue is an all-time low. It's literally the differential between the two. And as I stated previously, this is a very, kind of made up 4-week structure. Well, I would say this is kind of the more heuristic or just more common 4-week structure we'll see. This kind of the commonalities we'll see with it. And more so what I'm referring to is how weeks 1 and 2 will have a very kind of consistent uptick in fitness and fatigue. Obviously, we're starting off the start of the block with very low fatigue, assuming we're coming off of some sort of a deload, but meaning our level of fitness is lower as well. With us having a lighter deload, that means our level of fitness is going to drop off compared to lifting heavy. So it's kind of that kind of give and take that we're having, and why even having appropriately designed deload is going to be an important part of the process, making sure that next block is going to be as high performing as possible. But we'll see that kind of, once again, linearly, this isn't anybody in particular, just kind of a broad assumption. I would say that each one's going to gradually increase, as well as our level of performance will gradually increase as well. But then kind of, once again, I'd say for the vast majority of people I do have on a 4-week block, because I have some people, they work better on a 3-week block and deload the 4th week, or I have some people that work 5 weeks and deload on the 6th. But I'd say 4 is kind of a good happy medium that a lot of people do. But what we will see is that week 3, there's usually kind of not a drop off in performance, but just the amount of performance increase is going to be significantly less. It's kind of a down performing week. But just for some reason, that down performing week, whether the amount of fatigue that we get from it's going to be usually a little bit less than what we've been getting, or just the level of fitness from it's going to be that much higher, usually we'll see a very high performing week 4. Once again, this isn't anybody in particular. This is kind of a broad assumption. Is what we can kind of see like from a relatively normal fitness and fatigue model. And that's why, okay, we had that 4th week that is our designed week to be very high performing, even though fatigue's technically at its highest besides deload. But then that's why we do deload that following week. It's because when we kind of predict that, hey, performance can be very low, fatigue's going to be very high. It's kind of us resetting everything, if you will. Okay, so here is where we have a little bit of unique things going on with Mac. This is his deadlift progression. Kind of give a little bit of context behind this. This is a very new deadlift progression that we had started recently, and how basically we kind of got a lot of good data from his deadlift in the past. We've been doing a lot more just kind of technical stuff on it. Really got some things worked out, and really he has a very long torso, so back fatigue comes very quick, so trying to minimize that. And we'd really gotten that to a good structure, just having this insanely easy secondary day of still getting some sort of a hip hinge movement, whether it is a very light deadlift or even something like a stiff leg or an RDL. That's what's gotten us to feel good and actually feel strong on our primary day most of the time. But just kind of from past data, we had the best progress from slightly higher rep ranges, and we really hadn't touched them because we went into a meet and kind of obviously progressed that and got some lower rep ranges going and some higher weights. But we kind of want to see, hey, what can we do to kind of finally get this thing ticking now that we have the back feeling as good as possible and have you feeling fresh. So as you can see here, week 1 was, pretty subpar. It wasn't great, but that's kind of expected from week 1 coming off of a deload. His estimated max, or his projected max most of the time, or just that we calculate off of, is 255 kilos. So obviously 248, just a few percentage short of that, so not a huge issue at all. But what is weird is how low performing that week 2 is. We had a much bigger jump in RPE compared to the percentage that it should be, because obviously there's going to be kind of a assumed RPE with a certain percentage for a certain set, just based off of what his 1 rep max technically is. So that's what was weird, but kind of we said, hey, you've not really done a high rep range in a while. Maybe these sets of 5, that's the relativity for the high rep here. Maybe just you don't have the adaptations to them since it has been so long. We've been doing a lot of technical work, so we'll kind of see how it goes. And lo and behold, week 3 and week 4 were insanely high performing. We had the highest projected maxes than we ever had. So it's like, okay, boom, this is awesome. Maybe just we needed those first couple weeks, get used to the sets of 5, and now we kind of have the endurance and everything that comes with those sets of 5, need to produce the best results possible. So obviously 269 kilos for a projected max on week 4 is huge, and got us very excited. But here was the kicker. Obviously, we kind of thought we were past that, and we kind of see a normal progression of his actual intensity in the next block and kind of seeing what performance we had from that. But week 1 was subpar, a little bit better than last block, which is a great sign. But then week 2, we went down again in our performance, having a projected max of only 247 kilos. Kind of like, oh, shoot. Maybe this isn't what we thought it was. Maybe something else is going on here. But then just simply going back and looking at the previous block for the exact same projected, I guess, just per RPE based off of what his max is and the actual percentage I was programming him to, we had the exact same RP as we did the previous block. We went from being a 7.5 to an 8 on week 2. So I was like, hold on, we might not be bad here. Let's follow the data. And my prediction was that, hey, we're going to have the exact same thing happen this next block. We're going to have a huge and high performing week 3, then an even higher performing week 4. And that is exactly what happened. So something is happening along the way that just makes Mac not have a very high performing week 2, and then just have this insane trajectory for weeks 3 and 4, then obviously a very low performing deload. But that's not an issue. That's kind of the good thing. As long as we can continually recreate this and have this insanely high performing weeks 3 and especially week 4, and keep adding to what that projected max is and actually just hitting real PRs on that week 4, then we're going to be in a tremendous spot. And also this gives us great data on how we can peak him and knowing what part of his deadlift is going to be very high performing within a block and what part it isn't. And with that being said, I'm going to show you Nick and how insanely unique his structure is. So he is the only person I have that does a 6-week block with a 7th week deload. And it's not even as straightforward as that. This is technically 2 blocks on his program. We do a 3-week block where we have a very normal and linear progression when it comes to what percentage and RPE jumps we take within that block. But then we actually go straight into another 3-week progression without a deload, without an intro week. Literally, we just kind of do the exact same thing. But then always, we have this insane increase in performance on weeks 4, 5, and 6 of this big 7-week cycle, to where he just always has this tremendous performing week 6. I'm using his squat as an example. It honestly works insanely well on all 3 lifts, but his squat's the one where it's the most linear and we don't need to fine tune things as much. But his all-time PR right now is 512, and that's a very recent PR. His old meet PR is 479, but always on this last week, he just blasts a PR. Literally, it's been almost a PR every 6-week progression. All-time PR, not just like a projected max PR, but an all-time PR at a consistently lower RPE than what he had the entire 5 weeks leading up to it. And what is just so important here, I'm going to iterate this again, is just having an athlete or just having a coach that expects this high level of communication, even when it comes to something as simple as numerically tracking the actual data. Because all these things that are being tracked on here are being dumped into this master sheet here that's helping me determine the estimated max from each primary session, each primary set, the average intensity, the actual volume, whether it's going to be the amount of actual working sets or the actual tonnage. All these things are being dumped over into here, but I can only have that if an athlete does a very good job at actually filling out their RPE and just giving me all this crucial data to be able to put the very best thing on paper. And actually, let me give a quick shout out to my boy Justin Haig. He is a whiz with spreadsheets, and he's a great coach himself, and he actually made this awesome spreadsheet here with this coding system. And it's just, these are things I was having to do on paper previously. I was having to go through each block and look back like, all right, what was, peak intensity? What was average intensity? What was tonnage? All these things, sure, I had some tools on the spreadsheet to help me do it, but I'd still have to go back and do a lot of math every time I'd write a new block. But now here it is all right in front of me, and it lets me help see these trends and see these things way easier instead of having to do all this calculation. But once again, back around to it, if I didn't have Mac or Nick doing such a good job at filling out those RPEs, I wouldn't be able to see this awesome information here. So to have a proper, wrap up here and take home here is track everything religiously. Get you a coach that tracks these things for you and helps you really look at this data properly. And that is once again why I'll have just a big appreciation for somebody having a coach, just because if they've had this, experience with 50, 100 lifters over the course of years and the course of blocks and blocks and blocks, so they've seen some of these things before, and they have all these extra tools in their toolbox to actually apply to each athlete and be able to help with that problem solving here. But once again, none of that can be done if things aren't properly communicated. So that's why I do have such a somewhat high level and high demanding level of communication with my athletes, just so that, once again, I can do the best thing for them and give them the best program on paper. And also why I'm such a big fan of just a proper block structure and not so much of a, hey, we're making these weekly adjustments. Just because if I was going to make weekly adjustments, I would be trying to change too much, I'd assume. I'd be trying to make all these little micromanaged changes to where there's no consistency of data. We don't know what's yielding what results unless we kind of do these things for a few weeks on end. So I feel like some people unfortunately look at writing a block as something lazy, but at the end it's just me allowing to track data as accurately as possible and having a real scope on it. Because once again, it's almost like looking at a sample size. If we're trying to do a data and we only study one person versus 5 people, we're gonna have way more reliable data from 5 people versus 1. So obviously, if you have any questions about this, please let me know, reach out. And obviously, I'm going to put my jot form at the bottom. If you are interested in having a coach, I am here for you. Reach out, we'll talk, we'll get you going, we'll get you super duper strong.